Let me go ahead and start recording. 3, 2, 1.
I'm recording too. Okay, here we go. So, the Everglades. The Everglades are a large system of wetlands that span from Lake Okeechobee down to the southern tip of mainland Florida. Now, these wetlands are home to thousands of different plant and animal species. It also provides high-quality water supply for the southeastern residents of Florida, as well as nutrient-rich soil in the northern regions of the Everglades near Lake Okeechobee and central Florida. That's why the agriculture is very prominent there. Now, these diverse wetlands also provide a home for many recreationally caught fish like bass, snook, a bunch of different fish. These fish attract a large amount of tourists down to South Florida every year. Now, all these benefits that Florida's human residents get from the Everglades are all dependent on the health and the well-being of the ecosystem within the Everglades itself. So, one particularly important example of how the ecology, the ecosystem of the Everglades can have effects on the larger environmental processes is alligator ponds. This is a great example. Now, during the dry season, alligators will, or in preparation for the dry season rather, alligators will dig up using their claws and their jaws. They will dig up and unroot plants, soil. Now, this is unbeknownst to the alligator, of course, responsible for something called soil accretion. And after a large chain of events that happens after that process, it's actually one of the main driving factors in the high quality water flow that we receive in South Florida. So this is, again, only one example of how wildlife within the Everglades can be responsible for these larger environmental processes that are very beneficial to us. There are many more, but this is probably the best one. So I'll pass it off to Jose here.
All right, impacts on the economy. Invasive species have long been a problem in Florida and the Everglades, and one of their largest impacts is in the economy. According to nature.org, the cost of managing Florida's invasive plants alone is estimated at $100 million each year, and invasive animal species could account for even more. Economic impacts of invasive species are amplified in Florida and the Everglades due to the favorability of the climate to invasive plant and animal species. To go beyond the scope of the Everglades, the invasive species have affected the economy throughout the United States. According to invasivespeciesinfos.gov, a 2005 study estimated that economic damages associated with invasive species in the United States reach approximately $120 billion a year. To put that to perspective for you and I, that is near the entire net worth of Bill Gates in 1 year of damages. Next slide.
Now, I'm sure you guys have at least basic idea of some of the invasive species that live in Florida, especially if you are from Florida, as many of us are. The biggest one is currently Burmese pythons, or at least that is the most well-known one for a lot of people. This is for many reasons, both because of their size, the types of prey that they've been caught eating, like alligators even, and just in general, they're spread throughout the southern half of Florida. Mainly throughout all of the species, you'll find one connecting factor of how they got into the wild, and it is based mostly in the pet trade. This is both from accidental escapes from circumstances out of people's control, such as Burmese pythons are, a large part of their population is believed to have come from a escape during Hurricane Andrew, when the hurricane actually destroyed part of a pet and breeding facility that contained a lot of the animals. Other situations are more along the lines of irresponsible owners or just accidents happening. For example, iguanas and Nile monitors, a lot of them have just gotten into the wild from people's houses. It's very easy for these reptiles to get out of enclosures if they're housed outside, especially Nile monitors. As you can see, they've got massive claws that they can use for digging. And once they get to that point, if there are others, they will find them. And they are able to live a very long time in the wild because they have no natural predators and because they have a very, very wide diet that is available to them through Florida's natural wildlife and wild plants. Monk parakeets are the same. A lot of them were thought to have escaped from captivity, similar to the reptiles in Florida. And wild hogs is along the same lines as well, although some of them are also theorized to have gotten into the wild during a lot of the exploration period when explorers like Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto were bringing them over as livestock and trading them. And a lot of other species can follow the same paths as well.
Different invasive species have different effects on the ecosystem that they end up inhabiting. A lot of the most common invasive species end up following in this first kind of area where they end up affecting the food chain very just directly. The example brought earlier, the Burmese pythons, they're very prominent because they straight up will eat white-tailed deer and wren, which are very high, large creatures that normally are only preyed upon by alligators and panthers in their area. And the thing about that is that because they compete with these alligators and panthers, they end up affecting the top part of the food chain, which is already pretty big because that ends up affecting how the rest of the prey end up going along, and it affects the entire chain going downward. And with a different example doing the exact opposite is the Nile monitor. They eat mostly around aquatic areas. They eat owls, turtles, frogs. They can even eat the eggs of alligators, pelicans, and terrapins. The Nile monitor and the Burmese python both directly affect the food chain by basically forcing the natural inhabitants of the ecosystem to sort of evolve or basically adapt around them, which ends up as being a problem because these creatures have not evolved to adapt to these sort of creatures. However, these aren't like the only effects that could happen with a invasive species. Others examples can be basic overtaking of habitats or harming of habitats. The monk parakeet is mostly known for the overtaking sort of situation. They reproduce incredibly fast, and they end up making very large nests in very dangerous areas. And because of that, they end up being more like pests in a similar vein. It's like rats and things like that. And they're a lot harder to take care of. So monk parakeets end up just overtaking many urban areas, cities, towns, areas like that, and becoming an issue there. Green iguanas end up hurting more infrastructural areas near like waters. They like to dig near canals, waterbeds, anywhere that has like water nearby. They like digging their burrows and things like that, which ends up harming the infrastructure there. They end up causing massive problems when it comes to like the grounds and things like that. They overtake many habitats and do it in a kind of sort of similar way to the overtaking of a lot of food chains, where they end up becoming incredibly efficient at their job at basically surviving. They're very good at what they do. And with that, along with their digging the canals, they can end up becoming incredibly harmful pests and leading to more issues down the line. And there's another example with just basic spreading disease. They don't have to be as incredibly dangerous as a lot of them. While the wild boar in this example is incredibly opportunistic as a hunter, they're mostly known for like scavenging on like a lot of urban area trash and things like that, which isn't as bad as it is if it wasn't for the fact that they spread in a lot of diseases. They carry over 45 different diseases and spread that to the entire ecosystem, which considering how incredibly durable and opportunistic they are, which affects more than just the Everglades, it spreads out to the rest of Florida. And things like that sort of like affect just more out down the line. But overall, these are just like very individual examples. Of course, a lot of them end up taking several of these different like parts of the dangerous ecosystem. One of the most prevalent examples is the domestic cat. This is the most widespread invasive species. While all the other examples are incredibly dangerous and have more like ties to very specific stuff. The Burmese python is known for just hunting larger creatures. Same with the Nile monitor. The boar is opportunistic, but mostly known for spreading diseases. And some places, there's some creatures just overtake the habitats just by being there. The cat does all of that altogether. They are the most dangerous. They are widespread. They are everywhere. Urban areas, more rural areas. They hunt small reptiles, birds, rodents. They are responsible for several extinctions on other continents. And their introduction here into the Everglades is a big issue due to the Florida's like high amounts of reptiles in here, and cats are known to be very incredibly dangerous to reptiles. And because of that, it affects way more than it would just having one hunter. And not only that, but cats themselves actually end up spreading diseases to the Florida panthers and bobcats, which include rabies, leukemia, panleukopenia, things like that. That affects the wildlife out there. So the domestic cat overall affects several different elements of the ecosystem by just being an incredible hunter, just a very heavy breeder. They reproduce at a rapid rate, as well as spreading massive diseases. However, animals aren't the only thing that end up affecting the ecosystem.
All right, invasive plant species. Plant species also account for much of the Everglades invasive species. South Florida in particular is a breeding ground for invasive plant species due to the tropical-like conditions of the environment. Although the introduction of invasive plant species can occur naturally in an environment, humans have rapidly accelerated the process in locations like the Everglades. Humans have transplanted ornamental, medicinal, and agricultural plants, which have had negative effects on the ecosystem. Invasive plants can alter water flow and other factors in the environment, which can have ripple effects on vegetation patterns in the food chain. Here's an example of a common invasive plant species in the Everglades, the Brazilian pepper. The Brazilian pepper is an evergreen shrub with white flowers and bright red fruits. Although it may look pretty, it is quite harmful to the Everglades environment. The Brazilian pepper creates a dense canopy which can shadow out smaller plants. The Brazilian pepper also produces chemicals in the soil which prevent other plants from growing. The main method of removal is easy. You simply remove it like a weed by pulling the seed and plant out of the ground, which is something you may be familiar with. Next slide.
So current solutions to these problems that are either in place right now or are in place in terms of small trials would be, for example, for the Burmese python, we now use technology to use radio transmitters and tagging. So you implant a radio transmitter into these Burmese pythons, mostly males, and they're known as scouts, and you tag them with a little orange chip thing that you just kind of plant into their scales, and it allows people to track their movements and track where they're going, and they often lead to nesting grounds. By tracking these pythons and having them lead us to more pythons, we go to the capture programs where we remove these pythons and we relocate them in some cases. And from these relocations and removal, we also go to hunting, where as you're finding them, sometimes with invasive species, the best method is to kill them. Because they're overtaking so quickly, it's often best to eliminate the problem at the source. With the radio transmitting, it leads us to nests, and we can destroy the nest from there and stop the breeding population from continuing. Even though we're not going to get to all of them, a start is the important part. Next slide. The Nile monitor. Oftentimes we use patrolling areas where they're already well established. There are 3 locations where they have established populations of breeding and locations. So we go and we remove some of them from that population from time to time. People respond, professional trappers and whatnot respond to sightings when people call them, or when people need their assistance for trapping, because it's not easy to trap an animal like this if you don't know what you're doing. We also have new laws in place to prohibit the ownership of these Nile monitors. And if you already own a Nile monitor and you no longer wish to keep it or wish to get rid of it for whatever reason, you can use the Exotic Pet Amnesty Program, which tends to dissuade people from putting their pet into the wild and just getting rid of it that way. So it prevents the population from growing because of irresponsible pet ownership. And we have the humane killing method, which you will see pop up regularly with these invasive species as a way of controlling their population. We have feral cats. The way that this is probably one of the only examples that actually don't use humane killing as a method of control, because it would actually cause quite a bit of upset within the people. But what we do use to control these populations would be manage their colonies. A lot of time what you would hear from like animal shelters is they're trap, neuter, and return, where they take the cats from their colonies, they spay or neuter them, and they return them to where they were in the hopes that they can live out their life and they will not establish more populations through breeding. There's also removal, where we just take the cats from their colonies and put them in animal shelters. We can't do that for everything because eventually these animal shelters will run out of room. But in some cases, we will remove, for example, kittens and certain cats from the wild, We have education campaigns teaching people to spay and neuter their pets, so if they end up going out into the wild or escaping for whatever reason, they will not establish more of their progeny out in the wild. There's also education campaigns telling you not to release your pets in general and to keep them on leashes or within your sight. There's laws and regulations in place that dissuade people from allowing their pets to just be outside. If your pet is responsible for killing an endangered species, you can be charged with a heavy fine. If you abandon your pet, you can be charged with cruelty. And like I said before, with the neutering and spaying of your pets, it prevents them from, if they escape, from breeding and establishing more of the problem. Green iguanas, back on the humane killing track, we trap these iguanas and we kill them. There are professionals that we can call to do this kind of stuff for us here, but oftentimes locals will be allowed to do that. There are several public properties where you can go and basically hunt these iguanas. They are on the prohibited species list along with the Nile monitor because people, like I said before, may tend to release them when they do not feel capable of taking care of them. But again, the Exotic Pet Amnesty Program is there to encourage people not to do that and to give their pets away so that they can be relocated somewhere where they won't do damage to the ecosystem if they are released. The monk parakeet is a little difficult to get rid of. There's habitat alterations, so like was said before, the nests are actually quite a problem. They can weigh hundreds of pounds, and they're quite large. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll just remove these big nests, which will stop them from allowing that progeny to grow to the reproductive state and continue the cycle. And in some places, they have altered the structure of the transmission lines where they like to build their nests to make it more difficult for them to build their nests there, where they tend to like to build them. So it dissuades them from breeding, at least there. You can trap these two, and the humane killing method for these is to gas them with carbon dioxide. Some trials that have been implemented in certain areas is the use of contraceptives, which has shown to be moderately successful, the 68% success rate, and just deterrents such as audio noises, flashes of light, and certain deterrents that would dissuade them from being in the area. The wild boar has a decent, in terms of effectiveness, way of managing their population in hunting. A lot of people like to hunt for sport, so the wild boar is actually a very popular target for the sport hunting, food hunting as well, as their meat tends to be quite large because they're quite large themselves. If you're not into hunting, you can still trap them and kill them humanely. Some ways of preventing them from spreading into certain areas and causing damage would be to use fencing, but certain fencing must be used like hog wire, and it must go within a certain distance into the ground, or else the hogs will just tear through them, basically. And like the other ones, you can call professionals to remove them from your property, and they can get rid of them by killing them or relocating them to a different area.
Okay, now for the conclusion. So the Everglades provide many, beneficial resources for humans and the human residents of Florida. We've seen how they can be dependent, these resources and benefits can be dependent on the health of the ecosystem, and how damaging and harmful invasive species can be to the ecosystem of the Everglades in particular. Now, some solutions are currently in place right now. They are currently being practiced, while others are also being practiced, but sorry. Some solutions are being practiced currently, but others are being researched and tested. They're in that phase, but they could also prove to be effective. So we will have to see how effective those solutions become further down the line. And that's the conclusion. in the end.